Hi, Thomas. Oh, you're muted. Let me just ask you to unmute.
It's a good thing to check.
Of
Hi, Sam. Thank you so much for having me.
course, thank you for being here.
You can just call me Tom. I'm fine with Tom.
Good to know. Good to know. So how are you today?
I'm okay. I'm okay. It's an hour later here, so it's like a little, getting towards bedtime.
I understand that. I'm
How
like
are,
by 9:30.
uh, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good too. Excited to talk about short fiction, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's not every day you get. At least I don't get to do that every day.
Me either.
It's too bad that Chelsea couldn't. I'm sorry to hear about her. Is her mother or grandmother?
Yeah, her mom passed away.
Her mom. Yeah, that's a big one.
It is, I know. I sent her our condolences and everything, but we're going to talk about her. She'll be here in spirit. um, and definitely going to still like help promote the book and everything because it is really an incredible collection.
Yeah, yeah. They're really. They're great writers.
So are you. I loved your collection. It's like such a Texas collection.
Oh, thank you.
Of course.
Yeah,
We'll probably talk about that a little bit, and like studying and stuff like that.
yeah. That's true. It is a. Um, I don't think I've written much outside of Texas. Is it hot there?
In Austin,
Yeah.
today was like the coolest day in months.
Uh,
That's
I
been good, but not too hot lately.
I was there at the end of July and it was just unbearable.
Yeah, July was really hot. Hey, K-Ming.
Hi. Of
Thank you so much for being here.
course, thank you for inviting me.
Of course, I'm such a big fan.
Oh, thank you so much. It's so kind of you.
Oh. Yeah, so to our audience, we'll get started in just a couple of minutes, but if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat box, let us know where you're joining us from. If you're reading any short stories or short story collections you want to tell us about, we'd love to hear it.
Great, thank you.
How's your day been?
It's been okay. Yeah, I've just been doing some chores, so I kind of lost track of time for a second. But yeah, I'm here now, and I'm really excited.
Excited, yeah, me too.
K-Ming, I loved your stories. I loved your book.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. That really means a lot to me.
Really beautiful, beautiful and painful at the same time.
Thank you.
So to everyone just joining us, welcome. We will get started in just a couple of minutes. But if you want to say hi in the chat box, tell us your name, where you're joining us from, and if you're reading any short stories or collections right now. Oh, looks like the chat box wasn't on for attendees, but I fixed that. So you're all welcome to say hi now. Welcome everyone. Lots of folks from Texas, someone from California. Terry written a few short stories, West Texas style. Well, you should definitely read Tom's collection. It's all about East Texas, which is great.
And I used to live in Menlo Park.
Cool.
So fellow Menlo Parkian.
Cool, Jessica, you put out an anthology that's going to come out this month. That's really exciting. Congratulations. Congrats to you too, Ernie. First collection of speculative short fiction this year. That's awesome. All right, I am going to go ahead and get started with our announcements before we jump into the conversation. So hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sam Babiak, and I'm the program director for the Writers League of Texas. And yeah, so I just have a few announcements. So first up this Saturday, we have a class coming up with Natalie Lima. It's Introduction to Essay Forms. It's going to be a great class. She is a wonderful teacher and instructor. And if you're just interested in learning about the different kinds of essays that are out there, if you're trying to figure out how to tell the story of your life, this is a great class for you to take. So registration closes this Friday. And yeah, sign up before Saturday so you can get in. And our next third Thursday, our next free event for the year is WLT on the craft of writing horror novels. We're going to be talking about horror novels with two recent horror novel authors. It's going to be on Thursday, October 20th at 8 p.m. And it's totally free, so you can RSVP for that on our website as well. And next up, we also just launched our fall 2022 online classes and special events catalog. So if you are hoping to just plan all of the creative writing classes and special events that you want to attend for the rest of the year, definitely check that out. You can just like planning your fall, and we have over 20 classes, a ton of free special events. We have free write-in sessions. And I truly believe that there's something for everyone in this schedule. So I believe we're going to drop the link in the chat box if we haven't already. And I definitely encourage you to check that out. All right, and we have partnered with Book People, a local independent bookstore here in Austin, Texas, to sell and promote our panelists books. So I definitely encourage you to check out the link for that in the chat box as well. Chelsea Beaker, our third panelist for the evening, I am sorry to say is going through a personal loss and will not be able to join us tonight, but definitely check out her collection. It is really incredible. And we'll be talking to these two wonderful authors tonight about publishing short fiction and writing short fiction. Okay. All right, everyone, welcome so much to our WLT Third Thursday. I'm just going to introduce our panelists before we dive into the conversation. So first up, K-Ming Chang is a Kundiman Fellow, a Lambda Literary Award finalist, and a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. She is the author of the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice novel BESTIARY, which was longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize and the Faulkner Award. In 2021, her chapbook Bone House was published by Bull City Press, and her most recent book is Gods of Want. Her next book is a novel titled Organ Meats. She lives in California. Thank you, K-Ming, for being here.
Thank you so much.
And next up, we've got Thomas H. McNeely. Thomas H. McNeely has received fellowships from the Wallace Stegner Program at Stanford University, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Dobie Paisano Program at the University of Texas, among many other awards for his writing. In a starred review, Kirkus Reviews called McNeely's new collection of stories, Pictures of the Shark, an emotionally taut and often haunting collection. McNeely's first book, Ghost Horse, won the Geibel Press Novel Award. He has published short stories and nonfiction in The Atlantic, Texas Monthly, Weekly, Plowshares, and many other magazines and anthologies. He currently teaches in the Stanford Online Writing Studio and at Emerson College, Boston. Thank you, Tom, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, just get situated. Okay, so thank you both for being here. I'm so excited to talk about short fiction. So the last time that we had a short fiction conversation, the wonderful Elizabeth McCracken, she talked about the short story and she said it's like holding a universe in the palm of your hand. And I just loved that so much. And so I'd love to start the panel just by asking each of you how you think about short fiction. And also because you're novelists, you're essayists, you're short story writers, you're poets, where does short fiction fit into your creative practice as a storyteller? So K-Ming, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I took a fiction course one time when quite a few years ago with the teacher named Ratu Lapchuansap, and he is the author of a short story collection called Sightseeing, which is a wonderful collection. And I remember he once defined a story for us on the first day as something happens to someone. But then kind of in the middle of that class, because I was like, oh, I don't know, coming from a poetry background, does there even need to be a something, a happening, and a someone? I was very skeptical. I kind of brought my language first, kind of skeptical lens to that. And he later on defined a story as making something possible that was not possible before. And I think that I aspire towards that in all forms of writing, whether it's short stories or flash fiction, which is one of my personal favorite forms, or longer piece of writing, or even poetry, is the idea of making something possible that just was not possible before. And I think fitting short fiction within my own practice, to me, it usually starts with very similar to poetry, where I typically start with a line that makes me very, very curious. And I kind of tug at it like a loose thread and watch it kind of unravel down the page, rather than coming to it with a certain idea of structure or character or something happening that I know concretely I want to explore. So I feel like it's kind of an exercise in curiosity for me.
I love that so much. Tom, what about you?
I'm not sure what I can add to that. The short stories are just what I learned from what I read when I was much younger. And in a way, I think I only thought there were short stories. That's all that's all there was. I took a wonderful class with Elizabeth Harris at University of Texas, was an undergraduate, and she had us read Raymond Carver, Garcia Marquez, Italo Calvino, a huge variety of different short story writers. And it opened my eyes to what a short story could do, that there were so many different possibilities. It's by far my preferred form to write in. I love its compactness, and that so much can be suggested about a world, and that you can me at least, there's always a lot left unsaid or mysterious in the snapshot almost that you have of a world. So I love how large at the same time, also how small it is. I mean, so that's I love pursuing things in the short story, like K-Ming is saying, a line, or for me it's an image. I will start with an image or with a voice and see where that takes me, and it's always somewhere completely different than where I thought it was going to take me. If I'm doing my work correctly.
Right. Yeah, so I'll stick with you, Tom, because you're already speaking to my next question, which I'm really curious what the process of beginning a story looks like for you, whether you know it's a short story first or like what comes to you first, and then what steps do you take to really start just like writing a story?
It is, I was thinking about this today, actually. It's changed a lot. I think some of my earlier stories were more visual, started with a visual image, a place, or an image that was an interaction between two characters. And sometimes it's a very small image. There's a story that's not in my collection that I got the whole relationship between these two characters in how this character was looking at somebody else's boot. And that was the relationship between them came out of that. I think as I've it's become more about like hearing a character speaking as I've but it's an absolute mess. I mean, it takes a long time for me to draft stuff. And it takes sometimes a long time for me to discover what those characters are doing or what they want or how to structure it, how to structure a narrative, because I'm not, I think in some ways I'm a poet at heart, and narrative is not my first, kind of intuitive for me.
Yeah, it's really hard. But I love what you were saying about like being open to hearing the character, because I can't remember what author talked about this, but it's like a very spiritual thing when you're writing, and it's like it's not necessarily you exactly that is like you're like the conduit for the story, if that makes sense. So K-Ming, what about you? What does beginning look like for you? And then what steps do you take to unravel the story?
Yeah, I feel like I'm really good at listening to the beginning of stories and following through. And again, things like narrative, I agree. I feel like I'm not naturally narrative or kind of structure or form driven. But yeah, I think for me, it's always a first line. Sometimes it's a title. And I find that those two things are often married to each other in the way that oftentimes a poem's title is its first line or kind of functions as more than a title in a way. So I often find that when I'm not ready to begin something, it's because I don't have a prospective title in mind. And the title can always change and it can always shift, and I can always decide that it just isn't working. But it's those building blocks of language. I feel like once I understand the micro units of language, the really specific words that I'm gravitating toward, the images that I'm really interested in recurring in the piece, various motifs, that's when I start to feel a sense of foundation. So I think ironically, things like, character and situation and setting, which are typically foundations of the short story, are not really my foundation. For me, the language is enough. And I just need to find that language.
I love that so much. And reading your collection, like your poetic background, like I just want to take every sentence apart. Like it's just so incredible on like even the smallest levels. So yeah, I think we started talking about this already, just like how compact and contained the short story form is. And so you have really little time to build character, to build emotional resonance. But there's still a lot of room for like playfulness and experimentation and stuff like that. And so I really just want to talk about these like foundations of storytelling and in short fiction. And so Chelsea, although she's not here, I'm going to bring up a quote from her because I loved what she had to say about point of view and perspective. So she said in an interview from her latest collection that she's always trying to find the most interesting perspective in the room. And that's what she uses to sort of like build POV and character. And so I'm curious about what you think of that, Tom, and how you kind of inhabit your characters and just like, yeah, just how do you do that?
I think point of view, I mean, Henry James said that was the most important decision that you make as a writer, right? And especially in short fiction, it shapes everything. Um, I spend, I think finding, it's not really, I have to say, it's not usually a struggle to find the point of view. For me, it's it is a matter of understanding what the character knows and how much the character can come to understand in a story. And of course, what they're understanding and what the audience is understanding are two different things. What they come to understand, or what I try for in stories, is that it's still sort of mysterious to them what has happened, and in a way mysterious to the audience as well. So anyone who's taken a class, I teach fiction, and I'm kind of a nut about point of view with my students because I think it's so important. At the same time, I think really there's a space. There's a wonderful book by Stacey D'Erasmo called The Art of Intimacy, which is about relationship with the reader, how different books create different relationships with readers. And I think what she's really talking about in the book, I highly recommend it to anybody who's writing, is sort of space between what the character knows, what the reader knows, and that's where you're really communicating with the reader, if that makes sense, I guess. So it's fundamental, I think, being both kind of inside the character and outside the character in order to communicate what the character is. If you're too close, I think it can become difficult for the audience to understand.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up a little bit, how do you sort of like inhabit your characters and build characters? So I've heard of writers like writing a profile for them and just like really getting to know them. How do you approach character building, especially since you have such little time and there's so much more you need to know as the writer than the reader will eventually need to know? But yeah.
It's a voice. It's like being possessed. I mean, I really believe, when the ancient poet said, sing to me, O muse, or believe that the gods were talking to them, they were not kidding. I think I try to just be open to what those voices are saying. It all comes through the voice. I do very little research in my characters. Maybe I'm just being lazy, but
no, not at all. Okay, thank you. And so for you, K-Ming, I want to hear absolutely like what you think about all of this, but I'd also love for you to touch on the influence of mythology in your work and this idea of the collective voice.
Yeah, actually, that kind of dovetails perfectly into what my thoughts were on like character questionnaires and things like that. Because I'm not really interested in the individual as like a set of idiosyncrasies or as a set of interests and likes and dislikes, even though I know that is how we define ourselves. I would completely introduce myself as, here I am, I like XYZ. But I think in storytelling, I'm more interested in individuals' relationships to other people. And that's all of my stories gravitate around defining a person based on their relationship or role to either someone else or to a collective. So, as a daughter or as a member of a community or as part of a generational lineage or as part of a collective of, I don't know, feral children, something along those lines. I'm just so much more interested in relationally looking at characters rather than thinking of them as all as 100% constantly like active individuals. I just find that that's so much more interesting and ripe for different kinds of friction, And also I'm really interested in characters who observe and who may not always have the agency to intervene in a situation, but are kind of nonetheless always like proximate to things happening. I really enjoy effaced narrators, people who are, the narrators, but they're not the main characters, which is why when I was like in high school, I was like, I love The Great Gatsby. I think it was the first time like seeing that form of storytelling where I'm like, okay, I think I would technically be a better writer in third person, but I'm just so fascinated in the effaced first person narrator. But yeah, and then in terms of mythology, I think that's really related because I think mythology is collective storytelling that never quite belongs to a single person or even to a group of people. It's this, collectively owned, constantly being rewritten, constantly mutating form of storytelling that I'm really fascinated by. And so I try to think about, generational storytelling, for example, or familial mythology, or a mythology between siblings, and how to write about forms of storytelling that invite participation and invite collaboration, and also a certain form of irreverence. I think I'm really interested in.
Awesome. So K-Ming, I'll stick with you for this next question because I loved what you said about characters who observe, and I think that's such a cool way that you kind of world build in your stories too. And so I definitely want to touch on like world building and setting, because I think when we think of world building, like we think of like long sprawling novels, like science fiction and fantasy, like these huge like universes that the authors have created and they have to actually build. But world building and setting are still really important to the short story. And so I'm curious how you think about world building, and on like a practical sense, like what do you lean into to situate the reader in these spaces?
Yeah, I think in terms of world building, I rely on language a lot. I think language is an underappreciated form of world building. And I think even repeating certain words, metaphors, similes, they're all a form of world building, and all a way of creating a worldview as well. So for me, like I have one short story, this narrator describes this like mythical creature who has a severed head and is kind of bleeding constantly. And she says to the reader that that's what rust is. It's the dried blood of this creature that's constantly bleeding over the world. And I remember reaching that point and thinking, oh, I didn't know this. That's totally made up. But I'm really interested in the kind of child whose worldview that is, and who is telling it so matter-of-factly and so pragmatically to the reader. And that to me is a form of storytelling or of world building, is making that metaphor kind of literal in a way, and making it actually real. Whereas it could have just been kind of, the imagination of a child. It could have been like speculated about. Instead, it was turned into something incredibly solid, and as real as anything else in the story. And I think for me, making literal a metaphor or pushing a metaphor to its farthest point, that is a form of world building and kind of establishing what this character or narrator considers to be reality. And all of it is, for me, begins with language, and what kind of metaphorical or imaginative language this narrator has.
Yeah, and just to follow up a little bit, your stories, and I think part of like the world building in your stories, like everything is so visceral and so bodily in a lot of ways. Can you just talk a little bit about that and how important it is for writers to make sure that the reader is also having these like bodily experiences?
Yeah, I think part of that is definitely informed by mythology, and all of the bodiliness and oftentimes grossness of things like mythology and fairy tales. Even like Brothers Grimm stories are like incredibly, incredibly bodily, incredibly physical. And I think I'm also very informed by horror as well. And yeah, by the genre of body horror. I think for me, it's a way of looking at the world as animate, even the things that we consider inanimate or non-living, to kind of imbue the landscape with life, and to see everything as kind of feeling or embodied or capable of having its own life in a certain way. And I think that just draws back to all of the mythology and stories that I grew up telling or hearing and loving. Like I remember when I was a kid hearing the story of the Monkey King and how there's like this monk that was carrying around a rock and the rock gave birth. And I remember being so delighted by that as a child. I was like, the rock gave birth. Better go and collect some rocks and like incubate them and have them give birth. And I think I want to bring that that aesthetic and that sense of wonder and play and magic into my writing. So there are often a lot of very inanimate things that give birth in my stories, purely out of tribute to that. Yeah.
Thank you. What about you, Tom? How do you think of world building?
I wish that I could do what K-Ming does in her work of creating these completely both kind of solid and imaginative, these solid imaginative spaces. I admire that very much. I'm very literal minded when it comes to setting. When someone said about a critic said about my book, this latest book, that these stories could not have been set anywhere or anywhere else or at any other time, and I take that as a compliment. I always have it in my mind that a particular time or a place, and it's in some I wouldn't say it's sort of, I don't mean it to be documentary. I am trying to transform that world into a landscape that is caught in the imagination of a particular character, or how it's simply in how we're remembering that time too, if that makes any sense. So it's very bound by place and by Houston in at a certain time, in Austin, Texas at a certain time, and Corpus Christi, all those places. But at the same time, I'm not interested in a literal representation of them. I'm interested in them as I don't know, as these kind of almost mythological landscapes in a way. So yes, that's and I think there's also, for me, spaces inside the story narratively. There are different forms of the story. Some of them are very simple shapes, and some of them, like the title story in my collection, is very nested story within story and it's so that's also kind of a space to me that I'm very interested in the narrative space itself, is how you can put all these little rooms inside a story that the reader can wander around in.
Yeah, so I'll stick with you for this next question, because I want to talk about structure and like finding the structure for a short story. So you've kind of already talked about how you don't necessarily have a structure in mind and you kind of go along and you figure that out, which reminded me of this like metaphor of like writing being like sculpting, where you have this like big piece of clay and you're slowly chipping away at it and figuring out what the story actually looks like. And so I'm curious, like when you are looking for the structure of a story, how do you know it's the right structure? Like, I think, or just like, what are you looking for in terms of structure? Like, what does a certain structure offer you as a storyteller? And like for the story you were talking about, where it's nesting and there's little spaces and stories, where did that come from, and why was it important that the stories be structured that way?
Because that's what the story demanded. I mean, that's the only way that I find the structure of a story is by what that story needs.
Mm.
And some of the stories are very simple structures, and some of them are much less, they're much more complicated. I think, when I think about structure, I think about Alice Munro, of course, who had these very complicated narrative structures, but also Faulkner, who had this, like, he just had this amazing ability to know exactly where to go next in the narrative. And that's, I think that's, the structure is meant to move the story along. It's meant to get to deliver the narrative in the way that is going to be most effective. And that, to me, is just trial and error. Lots of trial and error.
Thank you. What about you, K-Ming?
Yeah, structure is my weakness, my Achilles heel. I feel like it's whatever structure I end up with, I always have to give credit to my editor or my agent for helping me find it, because I think I'm very revision shy, which is a terrible thing to be as a writer, because revision is like more important than anything. But I often find that that's what I struggle the most with, and what I find last in a story is the structure. It's kind of like the last puzzle piece or the last thing that clicks, which is kind of interesting because it's so major. It is so huge. It is about, just like the effectiveness of telling the story. But I always find that it can be really, really unexpected and satisfying to also find, like, the solution sounds a bit formulaic, but it's almost like when the story becomes so estranged or defamiliarized that something happens and you're able to see, like, oh, that made a difference. And it's transformed and become its, final Pokemon form and can be released into the world. So I find oftentimes it actually helps me to rewrite portions of the story, or to kind of almost write fan fiction for the story, where I put it aside and have a blank page and I, write a flash story from one of the characters' perspectives, or write this kind of completely separate piece that is adjacent to the world of that story. And that oftentimes ends up being like that missing puzzle piece within the story, or helps unlock something. I think for me, finding out what exactly I want to say and then finding the structure of the story kind of go hand in hand. And that's very late stage for me. I can write for a very long time without knowing what I want to say. So it's definitely a more painful process for me, but also really, really satisfying to land on those solutions.
Awesome, thank you. Before we move on to talking about publishing and short story collections, I want to end with one final question on the writing of short stories. So when I was doing my creative writing program, I had a really great professor. His name was Edward Carey. And he always used to ask us in workshops, how can you make this story stranger? And so I love to read acknowledgements and author's notes. And I was just so happy to find that this idea of strangeness in short stories came up in your author's note, K-Ming, and also in Chelsea's. And so in your author note, K-Ming, you say, thank you to my editor for seeing the core of these stories and guiding me toward the wild and the curious. And so I just love to hear your thoughts on why you think the short story necessitates this this strangeness, this curiosity, this wildness.
Yeah, I think the short story form is just so incredibly liberating, because I think there doesn't have to be a full narrative arc. There doesn't have to be a character who changes from beginning to end. I mean, I take that with all forms, but with short stories especially, there's just so much room for play. And there's so much room to make the form what you want it to be, in a way that I find that is just incredibly liberating. And I find that the element of strangeness, I don't know, it's almost like wanting to throw a wrench into your own work in a certain way, and or waiting for some kind of alchemical reaction to happen. And And by doing so, I feel like short stories can be incredibly transformative in ways that are maybe unexpected or out of left field or just not quite anticipated. I think once, at least for me, once I'm able to step back from thinking like, oh, this has to be this complete, all-encompassing narrative that has to say this and do this, I'm able to allow those elements of the strange or the wild or curious to enter the story more. And in some ways to kind of chase my own obsessions within the story. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm so curious what you have to say about this, Tom, because I think it's like the strange details that stay with you as a reader. And so when I was reading your collection, I love the story Ariel. And this alcoholic is like hiding his bottles and stuff like that. And there's this detail where he hides them in like the sewer. And so when it rains, the street floods more than usual. And I just love that detail so much. So can you just tell us a little bit about what you think?
I really liked what K-Ming said about defamiliarization. I mean, that's the final stages of writing a story and finding not only the form, but what that story is trying to say, or what that character is trying to say. And it should be, I think, deeply unfamiliar and deeply disturbing to the writer. If it's not unsettling to me, and if I feel that I understand the story too well, then I'm doing something very wrong. It has to be doing something that is I mean, I think stories are kind of, or narrative, for me at least, are these sort of moral laboratories, and they will produce the answer that you're going to get about the situation, about what the character has experienced, or what the meaning of that experience is for the character, should be, I think, something that, at least for me, is still leaves a kind of a question at the end of the narrative. I don't want the narrative to resolve itself in a final way.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I mean, my stories, I try to make my stories very sturdy. They're good structures in the sense that they're well, the parts fit together, but what the sum of it is if the story is working correctly, is kind of escapes the story, or escapes the reading. I think about that with Joyce, who was one of my first loves as those stories in Dubliners. Who knows what some of those stories mean? There is no bottom to them, and that's I think that again was sort of my idea of what a story should be, is this thing that you can't, it slips through your fingers.
Yeah, thank you. So let's move on to publishing individual stories. So you've done all this writing and revising, and so I'm curious, like, how do you know, one, when you're done with a piece, and two, do you have any tips or advice for writers who are getting ready to like put their stories out into the world? Tom, I can stick with you.
I used to keep all my rejection letters, but the file got too large, so and people no longer send rejection letters. I think a good piece of advice is to set it aside for a month or two or three, and then come back to it and reread it cold, so that you have that sense of defamiliarization that K-Ming mentioned. send it out to many, many places at once. And I think getting any kind of positive feedback from editors, send them a little note. Thank you. That's really, those kind of relationships are very valuable. So that's my 10 cents of advice.
Thank you. K-Ming.
Yeah, I think I know something is finished or done when I've kind of emotionally moved on from it in a certain way. When I'm starting something new and I'm totally consumed by something new, by a draft of something I've started, that's when I feel like I've been able to move on from something. Otherwise, I will kind of obsessively continue to work at it or turn it around in some way. Yeah, and I think in terms of like submitting things, it is kind of a relief sometimes to just to submit as a form of getting closure rather than thinking of like, I need to wait for this response to get closure. Because it kind of feels like, okay, the ball was in my court. Now the ball is in someone else's court. I can let go of it a little. Whether or not they respond or what the response is, I no longer am able to justify like constantly rewriting it if I place the ball in someone else's court. So I find that the act of just submitting it in itself provides something, even if it ends up, becoming nothing. And it is not the response that I hope for. But yeah, I think in terms of, I agree, just like submitting really widely and submitting to the places that you love to read, or that have work that has inspired you and that you really love. I find that it helps to be a fan of the place. Sometimes it can make the sting a little bit less intense. And also it's always great to feel like, I don't know, that you're like submitting to be part of that community or because you admire what they do. That was always kind of my strategy in terms of choosing where to submit.
Cool, thank you. And so I want to take a moment just to talk about rejection with submissions. And I think a lot of writers struggle with that because it can feel very discouraging. And like I have seen writers talk about getting like 80 plus rejections on a short story, and the 81st one is the one that they got the yes on. So just, do you have any advice or kind words for writers who are in this process of trying to get stories published? And I'll come back to you, Tom.
I think something to keep in mind is that the choice that the editors are making has probably more to do with the needs of that magazine at a particular time than it does as a judgment. I don't think you should ever think of it as a judgment, some sort of final judgment on the quality of your work. And with so many so many online magazines out there, I think the variety of places that you can send to now is expanded so much that your work will find a place. And to keep believing in what you're doing. I mean, I think a lot of the value of writing is what you're doing for yourself through figuring, asking these questions through stories for yourself.
Thank you. K-Ming.
Yeah, it's really interesting because rejection is kind of an invisible thing. We can see people's successes and we can see people's books and bylines and magazine pieces and things like that, but we never really see, unless someone, posts their rejections on social media and things like that. But even that is always not going to be as many times as we see a person's successes. So because of that, we always talk about rejection, but because we never see that rejection actually happening in other people's lives real time, it always feels a little like, oh my God, I'm the only one who is getting this many rejections. I must be like exceptionally awful, exceptionally terrible, all of those things. So I think just like keeping in mind how invisible rejection is, and how much we're inundated always by kind of the best of people's work and successes and accomplishments and things like that can be really helpful, just like touching base with yourself and reminding yourself that it's not exceptional to get rejections, and that it definitely is happening. It's not just you. Yeah, and then I think I really agree with a rejection is more about the person doing the rejecting rather than you yourself, because even like among your friends, there are probably going to be books that some of you hate and some of you love. And I know even among my friends in my writer group, like we have such disparate tastes and opinions on things that I always think, oh, okay, then it's completely possible that these 2 editors or 5 editors are just not the right readers for this story. And I think that's incredibly important to think of, to remember that publishing is a system of gatekeeping in a way. So sometimes it's a matter of what gates those are, and who the stories are for. And I think, yeah, just finding the right place is really, really important.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm going to move on to talking about collections. And so I'm really curious about when you all knew that you were writing a collection. Did you set out to write a collection? Did you look back and see, oh, I have all of these stories with very similar themes that I can put together? So how did that process start for you? And I'll stick with you, K-Ming.
Yeah, so I was definitely scrambling to figure out what stories to include in my collection quite late in the editorial process, which is probably not fun for anyone involved in the publication of this collection. But I think it was because I didn't understand the structure of the collection as a whole, and I was really, really struggling to find that. And because of that, I kept taking stories out and putting stories in. And what really helped me is the book is in a triptych. And I realized that throughout the collection, there was a repetition of M words. And I found that when I made a list of all of those different M words, I think it was like mothers, mouths, myths, moons, a whole plethora of moths, a whole plethora of M words. I was able to see that all of the stories kind of gravitated around certain words. And I've always been really interested in the triptych structure and form. So I was like, oh, this is my time to finally do a triptych. I've always wanted this to happen. So really interestingly, in order to find the really big shape of the collection, this like really macro problem that I was struggling with, zooming in on the micro and just thinking about what is the language that I was using, what are the recurring images, the recurring titles or character names, helped me zoom out and see the really resonant threads of the collection. So yeah, I feel like it's very akin to formatting a poetry collection or finding the shape or arc of a poetry collection.
Mm-hmm. I love that so much. And it reminds me of this author, Oscar Cáceres. He wrote the short story collection Brownsville. And when he was putting his collection together, he just like gave all the stories to his editor and was like, here. And his editor was like, you need to put these in some sort of order. So he like printed them out and put them on the floor and stood on a chair and like literally looked at them from like a bird's eye view and like figured it out that way.
See, I had my poetic writer moment where I did a really similar thing, which is spread everything on the floor. And I was like, ooh, this is a very writerly moment for me. This is very exciting. I feel very professional and artistic. But I definitely was similar in that I thought I could just kind of send every story I'd ever written and somehow a natural pattern would emerge. But really it is finding what it's almost like what stories are in a conversation with each other and what stories are rubbing up against each other and causing even more little like conversations and friction between them that when they exist alone, it's completely different. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And for you, Tom, I'm so curious how this went for you, because in your acknowledgements, you say that the stories in your collection were written over the course of 20 years. But you also have a lot of like recurring characters and stuff. So when did you know that you were writing a collection, and how did that process look like for you?
I wrote some of the stories before I wrote my novel, and some of the characters in the stories are in the novel. I wrote the earlier stories because I was learning how to write stories. And I continued writing the stories about some of the characters because I was still curious as to what was happening with them. There were other stories that I've written, during that time that are not in the collection. Some of them I thought should go in the collection, and then I then I figured out, no, they don't really belong here. The editor at Texas Review Press, PJ Carlisle, was incredibly helpful in sequencing the stories. I had no idea how I was going to what order I was going to put these stories in. And the order that we came up with was pretty simple, but it took us a long time to figure. I didn't have that moment where I'm looking at the stories for on top of a ladder spread out across the floor. It took a lot of kind of figuring what the most effective sequence to put the stories in was. But to your question of whether I thought I was writing a story collection, they kind of accumulated. And there are other stories that I've written that have nothing to do with those characters. Some of them do have the characters in them, but they're in a very different context. So it really is kind of astonishing to me, actually, that it seems to me that the collection came together in such an organic way when I hadn't intended for it to at all. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like magic.
It's magic.
Yeah. All right, so this will be our last question for the discussion before we jump into the Q&A. And we say this all the time, but one of the best ways to learn to write is to read. So I'm curious what your favorite short story collections are. What are some that you find yourself returning to really often, or anything that you're reading currently that you want to share? And I'll come back to you, K-Ming.
Yeah, I can think of two. There are definitely way more than two. way more than two, but two that just came, that just leapt into my head. And the first one is actually what inspired me to write short stories, which is a collection called Trash by Dorothy Allison, the same author, Bastard out of Carolina. And the very first story in this collection is called River of Names. And I love it because it kind of breaks every rule that they tell you about in short story writing, where they're like, don't use exposition and don't introduce 500 characters in the first paragraph. It blows all of that out of the water. And it was just this kind of litany and expository telling, not showing writing that I love so much. And it's also just a wild collection. Like it's, stories, really formally innovative stories about family, like immediately followed by erotica, followed again by a family saga. And I just thought it was so expansive and so mind-blowing. And I had no idea that books could exist in that form. So it's something that I return to again and again. And another collection that I really love is by Helen Oyeyemi, What is not yours is not yours, or it might be What is yours. The reason why I get it confused is because there's actually a phrase that my mom uses. And when the first time she saw the cover of the book, she was like, wait a second, did I write that? That is, what is yours, what is not yours is not yours. So I always have to say the full phrase. But it's a collection of speculative stories that are so playful. And again, kind of similar to what you were saying about Joyce's stories, there's this sense of bottomlessness, and these stories preserve a sense of mystery, which I love so much. It doesn't handhold the reader or try to over-explain. It allows the mystery to exist. And I feel such an affection and admiration for that she's not trying to ever explain to the reader. I mean, she's allowing that strangeness and that bizarre, brilliant, playful energy to be its own experience. I just find it so much more interesting and interactive in a way. So those are just two that come to mind, but there are many, many more.
Thank you. Tom.
Well, Dubliners was a big, I mean, that was a big early influence. The Beggar Maid, Alice Munro's story collection, which was so eye-opening that you could actually do these things with a short story. They were so the narratives, you didn't know what was sustaining them. They were, but something was making these stories go. Honored Guest by Joy Williams, which she just seems to be kind of in doing whatever she wants with the form. Are they realist stories? Are they speculative stories? You can't tell a lot of the time. And Gerald Murnane, his collected stories. He's an Australian experimental writer that I really like a great deal. But he completely, again, breaks every rule you can imagine in storytelling and gets away with it.
Thank you. So yeah, that is it for our conversation. Thank you both so much. Let's get started with the Q&A. So to our audience, if you have any lingering questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box and we will get to as many as we can. So first up, I'm going to throw this question to you, K-Ming. What advice would you give someone who has only ever written novels and poems? How do I adapt to the short story?
Oh, that's a really great question, because I think short stories are very close to poems in a certain way. I often find that I end short stories the way I would end my poems, which is this kind of like volta sense of surprise, or by taking an image at the beginning and have it recur again at the end. So I feel like if you write poems, the short story form is so perfectly suited to that already. Yeah, I would say to just have fun and be playful with it and experiment with it and see. I always really enjoy trying a new genre or form because it can feel like an escape hatch. It can feel feeling like an amateur or a beginner at something can actually be extremely liberating. And I find that I'm always chasing the feeling of being a beginner because that's where I'm able to surprise myself the most. And to find these like buried voices or stories that I didn't know I had within me or that I really wanted to tell. So yeah, I think just leaning into not knowing rather than feeling the pressure to be like, I have to be a master and like, read all the books about all of the conventions of the form. That's always helpful too. I mean, there's nothing wrong with learning the rules, but I think it can just to embrace like that liberating feeling of being a beginner in a form can just be ripe for surprise or unexpected things that can arise, which is really fun. I envy that.
I love that so much. Thank you. So this question, I think you both can answer if you'd like. Do you have a set writing schedule and what do you use to spark inspiration when writing? Tom, if you want to jump in.
Silence. I at this point, I mean, I have, I teach, I a very kind of a full life, and I just in writing when I can, and my schedule changes a lot. As far as inspiration, I find I have plenty that I want to write about. It's a matter of making the time to do it.
K-Ming?
Yeah, I really agree. I was about to say, ideas, I can have multiple a day. Tons and tons of ideas. It's a matter of like what idea will actually kind of stick and be something I'm really interested in working on. But I think for me, it naturally ebbs and flows. So rather than a writing routine, it's almost like the seasons, I have my more like retreating period. I have my periods of feeling really fruitful and writing constantly for 10 days at a time, 2 weeks at a time, 3 weeks at a time. So for me, I just try to make my schedule as flexible as possible while still managing various things, so that when there is that sense of flow, I'll be there to kind of catch it, and to hopefully be able to write a little bit when that kind of sense comes. But I think before I was definitely the kind to like, oh, I will force myself to write no matter what. And if I have a week where I write nothing, then that's a failure of a week. And I just realized that that led to burnout a lot for me. Like that it was just so incredibly easy to lose any sense of all sense of bearings and any sense of motivation. So now it's kind of just, okay, I want to be there when it's there. And when it's not there, I'll still be kind of working on it in the back of my mind, but try not to pressure myself and force myself into it.
Yeah, thank you. Next question. What do you find is the largest difference between your approach to long and short form fiction? Anyone want to jump in?
I think, I mean, having written one novel, it's not an experience I particularly want to repeat at the moment. It required, I think the difference to me at least was that the novel required quite a lot of planning. Not that I planned everything out before I did it, but that it's 300 pages and you have to find ways to organize and keep track of things. So I used a lot of different sorts of outlines, things like that, which you don't have to do in a short story. A short story, it's all right there and in this nice compact form. So that to me is the difference to those two forms. Yes.
K-Ming, anything to add?
Yeah, my first response was like, oh, writing novels is terrible. It's so painful. Yeah, I've been kind of in a novel writing mode for about a year and a half. And it's really interesting because I don't outline at all with novel writing. So I'll like start a draft of a novel, reach 30,000 words, then realize it's going nowhere and then start over again. So I feel like in some ways for me, a novel is the stakes are a little higher. So failing at writing a novel is a lot more painful than failing at writing a short story. So I do really love the short form in the kind of like endless resurrective mode that you get to be in, where it's endlessly like I can start over, and there's always a possibility of it feeling low stakes, which I really enjoy. I like when writing is low stakes. But yeah, but with novel writing, I mean, okay, it's not all terrible, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it. But I think it does feel like more of a leap of faith in a certain way. It's a little bit more like, oh, like, okay, better brace myself. And then I think the stamina of it is something that I kind of had to like train myself to do the way people train to become long distance runners in a certain way. And I think both require like incredible skill. It's not that one is easier or harder. It just like activates different parts of yourself and taps into different, I was about to say taps into different insecurities, but that sounds very negative. It also taps into different strengths. So yeah, it feels different in terms of the process.
Cool, thank you. All right, so this will be our last question for the evening. And I'd love for you both to answer this one. Who else reads your drafts? Just your editor? Do you have beta readers, a writing group? Tom?
I've been very lucky to be in the same writing group for 27 years. And that has been invaluable. Other people read my work. My partner reads my work. I have different readers at different stages. In early stages, I'm quite protective about about letting people read it because it's at a delicate stage. But later on, I think almost kind of showing it to random people to get a sense of how somebody who has absolutely no connection to your work would respond to it has been valuable to me.
Yeah, thank you. K-Ming.
Yeah, I'm very deeply protective of my drafts. So it's often that no one no one gets to read anything until it's printed, and I have no ability to change anything. And even showing my editors and agents, I have to give myself a lot of time and preparation, and just kind of turning it over and over in my mind. I do have a writing group who's really wonderful, and I think being part of that writing group has which we do a lot of writing exercises. Feedback is sometimes a part of it, but it's often not. So it feels kind of like a communal writing experiment or exercise. But I found a lot of value in knowing people's lives and reading their writing, which I know is not really possible outside the context of a writing group. But I love getting to hear about what people's lives are like, and then to see these kind of Easter eggs pop up in their writing that trickle in from their life. Yeah, I find that really inspiring and very enriching in that particular reading experience. It's like being pen pals with someone in a certain way, where our writing becomes correspondence about our lives. In not in like super literal autobiographical ways, but just in like a certain word or metaphor or an object that will come up. And I'm like, hey, we were just talking about this. And that's been really wonderful and intimate. I think I forgot about like the intimacy of sharing writing until I was with my writing group. So yeah, but overall, I think I'm quite protective of my drafts. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, that is it for tonight. Thank you both for your generous insights. I had such a great time talking to you. Thank you to our audience for joining us. Thank you to Book People for partnering with us. We'll put the link to the Book People page in the chat box. So definitely go out and buy these collections. They are incredible. And have a good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
You too. Bye.
Well, is that it?
Yeah, that's it. But I was looking to end the meeting, and I'm not the host right now, so I couldn't end it. But you are welcome to log off and have a great night.
Well, I really thank you so much for having me on this program. It's been so